Welcome. This is the fourth of our five webinar series, and this time it's about the viewpoint diversity. I assume that since you are here, I don't need to say much about why diversity is important. I assume that you are already believing that, but I do want to make a distinction just to frame what we're going to talk about today. So when we're talking about the importance of diversity, there are overall two arguments that are often made. And one argument is sort of a social fairness argument. So there might be marginalized groups that will have a difficult time getting a break unless you take steps to actively include those groups through diversity initiatives. So that is one argument. And the other argument that's often made is that diversity can lead to better decisions because you bring in more diverse perspectives, and as these perspectives have a dialogue with each other, you are more likely to have end up with good decisions. And of course, these two arguments are not mutually exclusive. It is completely possible to do both at the same time, but they're not the same. And it's kind of important to understand that they're not the same, because if you're so in this webinar, we focus more on the second. We focus on diversity as a means to create better decisions. And if that is what you're focusing on, sometimes you can have more demographic style diversity that serves as a proxy. So you can say, if you invite people from different national backgrounds, different gender, different educational backgrounds, all these kind of things, you might get viewpoint diversity, but you may not, because you can imagine a group that is very diverse in terms of nationality, gender, and all these kind of things, economic, socio-economic background, and so on. You can imagine that they all went to the same school and learned the same things and were indoctrinated in the same thing and work in the same organization and bought into the same organizational frameworks. So actually, where there is a lot of demographic diversity, there might be no viewpoint diversity. And what we are interested in this is viewpoint diversity. And it's a concept that we have borrowed from, what is it called? There's a Heterodox Academy. So this is Jonathan Haidt, an organizational psychologist, and some other people who they were concerned about how the debate around about diversity in higher education was progressing, and they introduced this concept of viewpoint diversity and say, well, we're behind diversity, but it's viewpoint diversity that we're behind, because sometimes the debate around diversity in higher education actually shut down viewpoint diversity, which is a problem. So this is just to set the frame for how we in this webinar approach diversity. We're looking at specifically at viewpoint diversity, and we are looking at it as something that can help get us to better decisions. And of course, when you have viewpoint diversity, you also have the potential for polarized dialogues. And this is where, of course, Sarah's and my skill set comes into play, because to manage viewpoint diversity, it's really good to have a solid toolbox for managing dialogue. And with that framing, I'll hand it over to Sarah.
Thank you, Claus. So we're very much weaving together in this webinar what Claus has been saying there about viewpoint diversity, productive dialogue that doesn't descend into polarization, entrenched positions, and people digging in even further to rigid viewpoints, but a dialogue in organisations where you can access collective intelligence so that the whole can be greater than, not less than, the sum of parts. And in order for you to harvest collective intelligence in a group with diverse perspectives, there are certain conditions that need to be met, and understanding those conditions can really help you if, for example, you're going to run a board away day or have an offsite for one of your leadership teams. So I'm going to speak about those conditions, and then we're going to make it all really practical, which is what we love to do in these webinars. So hopefully you can go away from here with a couple of things at the very least that you could actually practically apply. So I'm just going to reference a book that's been very influential in my own thinking. And this is a book called The Wisdom of Crowds. It came out in 2004. And the author, I'm going to struggle to pronounce his name correctly, but it's James Surowiecki, something like that. I can put the reference in the chat for you. And one of the standout sentences in his book is, "It's as if we've been programmed to be collectively smart, we as human beings." And there's a whole series of experiments and research that psychologists in particular have done to show that. And one of the classic experiments that you might have come across is when they bring in a big jar of jelly beans and they ask people to estimate the number of jelly beans in the jar. And what they found over time, and this has been replicated, is that the arithmetic mean of the different individuals' estimates is typically more accurate than any one individual's estimate. So that's why he's sort of concluded it's as if we've been programmed to be collectively smart, because that arithmetic average is the most accurate. There is, however, a kind of but to that, and certain conditions need to be in place to yield that pattern. And if you don't have certain conditions in place, you don't get that collective intelligence effect. And so what do we know also from the organisational world? I'll come to the conditions in a moment. But yeah, the best decisions, the decisions that stick, are often the product of disagreement and robust dialogue where people can really challenge each other. You could thrash out a proposal, nobody leaves the room feeling offended, but you've had a really good quality dialogue to land you a really effective decision that also sticks. It's a high quality decision and it doesn't unravel as soon as the meeting ends. So let's come to these conditions then that support the accessing of collective wisdom and the effective decision making. And one of the conditions is, as Claus has already been talking about, viewpoint diversity. So you want to have in the conversation people holding very different perspectives, and Claus is going to say a bit more about that a little bit later to bring that to life. You want those people to have independent points of view or some kind of expertise as well. It's almost like if you think of a jigsaw puzzle, everybody in the room ideally is holding a distinct piece of the puzzle. Decentralization can be really helpful, and by that I mean that you've got people involved who are holding very local knowledge. So one organisation I've worked with recently, I've facilitated a number of their board away days. So we've got the exec directors in the room and then we've got the trustees in the room. but they've also decided to include service users. So this is an organisation in the social care sector. So they've got 2 service users as trustees, and because they have learning special needs, they're also bringing in a helper, an assistant, an advocate with them as well. And so facilitating amongst all those different people and layers is a good challenge, and it's invaluable to have that sort of frontline perspective in the room shaping the board's dialogue and decision making. So decentralization, really helpful. And the final condition I'm going to cover just before I hand back to Claus for a couple of tools to really bring this to life is what you could call aggregation. So how is it you move from the individual thinking, so back to the jelly bean example, the individual estimates, to getting a collective picture? And what you don't want to do is move to the collective picture too quickly. So you only get that pattern with the jelly bean estimates if you give individuals sufficient individual thinking time and independence for them to look at the jelly beans, write down what they think the correct answer is. And once all that has taken place, only then would you, for example, calculate the average score. What that means in organisational life is that in a meeting, you might want to give people some prep work to do so that they can do some individual thinking before you get to a group discussion. So you're not combining perspectives too quickly. That's the aggregation principle. So, wisdom of crowds, there it is, under certain conditions. And now I'm going to hand back to Claus for a couple of practical tools, and then you'll hear from me a little bit later once you've heard from Claus again. And after that, we're going to open it up for discussion amongst us, and your questions, comments, observations, your wisdom, really welcome here. But over to you, Claus.
Yeah, thanks. So so building on that, those four conditions, the first of those conditions is exactly the diversity of viewpoints. If you need to have people in the room who have who see things differently, so that you can weed out biases. And to do that, it can be quite useful to sit down and write out a list of who should be in the room. So you really take time to put together that list of who to invite. And there's a couple of ways that you can ensure that you're making a list that gives a high probability of viewpoint diversity in the room. And of course, the first thing you can do is just to think about, let's say you're having a meeting, you are going to make a decision in those meeting about something, or you're discussing certain plans. It might be good to write down a list of all the people who are affected by that decision, because if you're affected by a decision, you're likely to have a viewpoint on it. And if nothing else, you can contribute with information about how different decisions are how they're gonna affect you. You're sort of the expert on that. So you want to make sure to think through all the stakeholders who's gonna be affected by the plan or the decision that we're gonna make. And then you have to identify people who can represent each group, who has that localized knowledge. And you can pick people who might be articulate, or who are deep in that group, so they really have good, solid insider knowledge. Then one story that I like to tell here is once I had a brief career as a department manager, first a line manager, and then a department manager in a big multinational transportation company. And it's kind of a funny story, but I was hired to into the customs department. So that's the department. They have a lot of packages. Some of them come from outside the EU. There has to be custom declarations, and they have to be cleared. I think they can send the declarations when the package crossed the boundary of the country, and it has to be cleared before the package arrived to the central distribution channel, because we need to know which packages to take off and put in a holding. And since Denmark is rather small, the distance from any border to the central distribution, that's like a few hours at the most. So not much room for error. And I didn't know much about transportation, and I didn't know much about customs either. I got hired anyway for different reasons. And but for this reason, whenever I went to a meeting with the management team, I thought I'd better bring one of the people on the floor with me, because they might ask technical questions and I'm absolutely blank. And then I observed something very interesting. Multiple meetings I observed. First of all, whoever I brought, they were always scared, right? Because they're like, oh my God, we're going to be in a meeting with all the bosses of the different departments. And I'm like, it's going to be fine. And multiple times what I saw was that the heads of the departments would discuss something, and then they would make a decision. And then the person I brought would put up their hand and say, actually, that's a bad idea. And then they would say, well, why is that? And I was surprised at the amount of the number of times where the answer was, because that's illegal to do. So it's really important to have people who have that localized knowledge, who can say, I think we need to do something different. Many times they would then ask my backup person, well, what should we do? And they would come up with a plan, and we would just end up doing that. And I think that was so fascinating and very, it taught me a lot about the importance of having the right people in the room in order to make good, solid decisions. So, and this means whenever it's possible, you need to have people in the room who have concrete, up-to-date experience about the operational level of the organization. Some specialists have to be there. And sometimes that means not just specialists in terms of training, but also in terms of you need people from lower levels of the organizations. You need representatives from there, because so you have that vertical flow of secured that vertical flow of information as well. Other people that will be good to have in the room are people who are comfortable opposing other people. So this is not really a specific stakeholder group. This is more a psychological profile, but somebody who's unafraid of pointing out when there's inconsistencies or incoherence in the discussion, something that doesn't hang together, and say, look, you say this, but then you also say that doesn't match. So they might not even know what's wrong, but they can spot when something is not coherent, and they're unafraid of pointing it out. So sometimes that psychological profile can be really useful to have in the room as well. Then it's also good to have junior people in the room, people who are fairly new hires, because they're not indoctrinated into the organizational way of thinking. They have fresh memories of how they did it in another company, somewhere else. All the things that people in the organization take for granted, they don't take for granted. They still think it's odd, and they can potentially say that it is odd. So they are really important. And of course, when I say junior people, I also have to say the old guard. People who have been in the organization for a long time can be very useful to have in the room, because they're kind of the organizational memory. So when people in the room say, oh, let's try this, and they get really excited about the plan, people who have been there for 20 years can say, yeah, we were equally excited 2 years ago and 4 years ago and 7 years ago and 10 years ago when we tried the exact same thing. And here's why it didn't work back then. Things might have changed, but it's important to have that organizational memory in the room so we don't run around and get very excited about trying something that we've already done. It's a little bit like when I teach research methodology at Copenhagen Business School. One of the slides I have is this big slide that says, please don't do research that's already been done. And this is the same, right? But just in an organizational setting. So in research, you check the academic literature. In organizations, you check people who have been with the organization for a long time. So that's one way of putting together a list of people that will ensure viewpoint diversity. Think about who are all the people affected by what we are going to talk about the decision, who are the stakeholders. Get people from both high and low levels in the organizational hierarchy, and both new hires and old hires, and among those also include people who are comfortable opposing other people. If you have such a list, then you have really good conditions for having interesting discussions. So that was the first tool, who to get in the room. The second tool I want to talk about is then how to secure independence. So that's the second criteria that Sarah was speaking about. The first one was we need viewpoint diversity, but we also need a certain amount of independence. And there are a couple of very concrete mechanisms that might run counter to securing that independence. For example, if you include new people, they might be just hired, so they're on the trial period, they're very easy to fire, and that might make them a little less enthusiastic about voicing their opinion if it's controversial. So yeah, if you are on these, or people who have been around for a while but they're up for promotion, that might also be a time where people think, ooh, I better tread lightly here or be careful not to make the kind of people who are involved in that decision mad at me. Then there might be people who, if people are very new in their role or in the organization, they might also think, well, I don't understand the problem well enough to voice my opinion. And of course, that might be true, but it's still good that people voice their opinion, because if you voice your opinion, even if you're concerned about a particular decision and you voice that opinion and it's unfounded, you still get through that part of the dialogue where you clarify why it's unfounded. And that might not just be good for you, it might be good for everybody in the room. So it's, that's another situation. And then, of course, you might be in the room and then you spot somebody else in the room and you know that person can somehow make your life difficult. You might be dependent on keeping a good relation in order to get information flow from them. You might be dependent on getting things done through informal channels. Or, of course, they might be higher in the hierarchy and make it difficult for you to be picked out for promotions. So, and again, so there's a lot of these mechanisms. These are the type of mechanisms that will make people adjust their viewpoint to somebody else's viewpoint, and therefore you lose independence of viewpoints. So Sarah mentioned a bit of how you can do that, and anonymity plays an important role. Smaller groups plays an important role. I'm just going to go through a list of sort of inspirations for how you can tackle this problem. So as Sarah also mentioned, it's very good to give people questions that they can reflect on in advance of a meeting. um, and setting their thinking process in motion while they are still alone. Because, well, then they are going to at least solidify and develop their thinking independently. And when they then arrive at the meeting, they might have formulated individual viewpoints. I remember a manager I once talked to, and she was very systematic about this. She said, if I need an important meeting, I will always send out few questions and an agenda at least a month before. And she said, it's like, because when people know what we're going to discuss, even if they don't consciously think about it, they're going to dream about it. They're going to, maybe it's going to come up in a conversation at family dinner or something like that. There's no way they're not going to process it, even if they're only processing it unconsciously. And this is one way of encouraging people or helping people formulate individual opinions. Anonymity is important. Yes, as we often mention, when we do work in-house in organizations, Sarah and I will always have confidential talks with everybody who's going to show up for the meeting, so that we understand what are the independent viewpoints of everybody. And of course, it has to be. If you say a conversation is confidential, you have to think really carefully through how to keep it confidential, because especially in smaller organizations, if you say, well, I spoke to somebody and they had this view, the other might think, yeah, we know exactly who's got that view, or we can guess very easily who's got that view. So you have to think through it very carefully. Another thing that's very important to preserve independence of viewpoint is carefully think through the speaking order. If senior people voice their opinion early, then that might have a bigger impact on others than if more junior people voice their opinion early. So you can think about who should speak first and last in order to optimize independent thinking and development of viewpoints. Small group discussions are also really important. Many times you can even have a sequence. You can put a question and ask people to just write down their thoughts. Then they will start developing their thinking completely without any input. So they just write down their thoughts. Then they can turn to the person next to them and just share their thoughts. And they've already prepared the thoughts because they've written it down so they can be more articulate. They share the thoughts with somebody else. And you can think about that as a rehearsal round for communicating your viewpoint and feeling more confident about communicating your viewpoint, because you're rehearsing it by telling it to one other person. And then from there, you can either go to a slightly bigger group, or you can go to plenum, to the full group, depending on what time restrictions and judgment call. But this is a fantastic way of doing it. Start by writing, talking to one person, and then opening it up from there. Because I think, well, Sarah talks about introverts and extroverts. I would imagine that, of course, for introverts, it's very nice to think things through yourself before. But even for extroverts, you might discover what you think while you're talking. And it's nicer to discover what you think while talking to one other person that then hear you being slightly incoherent and changing your mind and having insights and stuff like that, than if you have to display that internal thinking process in front of a whole group. People might pull a little more back from that. So small group discussions. Then, as a facilitator, if you are a facilitator of the dialogue, you are naturally in a position of authority. And sometimes you might hear somebody is voicing a viewpoint, and then nobody else is really listening. The dialogue is moving on without paying any attention to it, or somebody else comes in and steamrolls them a bit, and you see they pull back. It can be very useful as a facilitator to lend your authority to viewpoints that would otherwise be missed. So if you hear somebody voicing something, regardless of whether you agree with it or not, you might say, well, actually, I just heard you say this, and this is not crazy. And then you say a little something and you support it a bit. And if it gets your support, it might get over that hurdle and get into the conversation rather than just being steamrolled or passed by without anybody noticing it. So that's another one, lending your authority to viewpoints like that. And then, of course, the last one is I'm gonna include it. It's not so much about securing independent thinking, but I still think it's very good, and it relates a little bit to the last point that Sarah was talking about, the aggregation mechanism, and that is two questions that I learned from Sarah, and we are both big fans of them, and that is, once you have had a good discussion and you understand everybody's viewpoint and you can see the dilemmas and you can see where each person is coming from, even if you don't agree with them and stuff like that, how do you move towards that formulation of a shared common understanding? Very good question is to ask, if this group was speaking with one voice, what would it say? Because that starts gelling it together and say, okay, now we understand everybody's viewpoint. If we should speak with one voice, what would we say? So that is a very nice question. But as Sarah said, don't bring it in too early. You want a good long discussion between the individual viewpoints before you come to the point where you will bring in a question like that. So that was the first tool, was how to secure that you have viewpoint diversity in the room. You think through who can I invite that represent different stakeholders. How can I have people from different levels of the organization, people who are comfortable saying no, and people with different levels of seniority. And then the second tool here was, how do I then secure independence of those viewpoints and preserve the independence of those viewpoints despite the different mechanisms that might encourage people to modify their viewpoints once they're in the room. And we went through a number of suggestions. One, give people questions they can reflect on in advance so they have a chance to develop their independent viewpoints. Have anonymous and confidential conversations with people where they can feel safe in formulating and communicating the viewpoint, at least to you if you're the facilitator of the meeting. Think about speaking order. Who should speak last? Should be the people who are most likely to influence other people's viewpoints. Have small group discussion and some writing in the room, also writing, speaking to the person next to you and then to the whole group, as a way of giving people space and time to develop and rehearse the communication of their viewpoint. Lend authority to people who to viewpoints that would otherwise be overlooked. And then when you feel you are ready to start the aggregation process, you can ask the question, if this group was speaking with one voice, what would it say? So 2 tools, and I'll hand it back to Sarah for the third important tool in how to navigate viewpoint diversity and get the most of it.
Thank you so much, Claus. So I will come to this third tool, and I'm also going to put what I said I'd put in the chat as well, which was that book reference about the wisdom of crowds that lays out so clearly what these conditions are that we're looking at, so you can really get the collective intelligence flowing in the room. So I just want to, the third thing I want to cover really, it's almost like taking a bit of a step back from the things that Klaus has been exploring about how you create the environment that can hold the heat sometimes of viewpoint diversity. And so in dialogue work, there's a particular term that is used for this. It's a strange term. Um, you might like it, you might not like it, but we talk about building a safe and energizing container for the dialogue. And by container, we mean a sort of holding environment, an atmosphere that is expansive enough that it can hold the heat of difference. Because, as you know, we want viewpoint diversity, but it can provoke real tension sometimes, a sense of conflict. Some people, some discomfort comes in the room and they just want to sort of run away or sweep the issues under the carpet. And so building that container is absolutely critical for when there are moments of heat coming up in the discussion. And so I think container building is a fine art in dialogue, but one way to make that really practical is to think about the ground rules that you set early on in a session. So again, this is just to keep practicalities in mind. Klaus has already spoken about the importance of doing the one-to-ones before a session, making those confidential. And when I do those, one of the things I'm often listening for are what are the group agreements or ground rules we could put in place, in particular to support the people who are more junior, the more recent joiners, people in the outer layers of the organisation, so that they can find their voice and contribute as fully as they can to the dialogue. If I go back to the example I spoke about earlier, so working with that board in the social care organisation, one of the ground rules that we put into place was there's no such thing as a stupid question. And so we wanted to create an atmosphere, a container that had good amounts of curiosity in it, where people could feel safe to share half-baked ideas and so on. So no such thing as a stupid question. Other ground rules that Klaus and I have used have included things like nobody gets to be wrong here. So let's bring in all the diverse viewpoints, but without making anybody else wrong. And tonally, that can make a real difference to a conversation. And a final example of a ground rule that we've used a lot as well is welcome uncomfortable moments. There might not be any, but if there are, then let's just take a deeper breath, slow down, and explore what's going on in those moments of discomfort. And I can think of several examples when I've contracted with that, with a group, with a team. Things then, maybe it's not immediately, maybe it's on the afternoon of day one or the morning of day two. Some discomfort has arisen because somebody's actually taken a risk to say a hard truth, to ask a really challenging question. And then I really feel I've got the permission of the group, because we've contracted for it, to say, hey, let's slow down here. What's the question behind that question? Or however you're going to go in and unpack that moment of discomfort, rather than fighting shy or going back into a polite dialogue. that doesn't really address the real issues. So there's lots more I could say, but I'm going to leave it there in terms of building that safe and energizing container that can hold viewpoint diversity, because also you've got a set of ground rules and group agreements that you've contracted for early on. So that's our third very practical tool here. So we would love to just open this up just for your questions, comments, observations. I'm also going to ask you, in terms of what you've heard, what could you see yourself taking away and applying? Maybe you adjust it, adapt it for your team, your organisation, whether it's something about the ground rules or thinking differently about who's in the room or how you get that independence of thinking happening. We're a small group, so you could just raise your hand physically, unmute yourself, or you can raise a digital hand so we can see it. But it would be lovely to hear from you. Yeah, lovely. Thank you, Noreen. I think that Mentimeter, the word clouds that build on the screen, or in a Zoom setting using polls as well, where you've got the multiple choice answers and you can see the bars filling up on the screen, I think is great for doing a temperature check, getting some engagement. And as you've said, it can also preserve anonymity as well. So I wholeheartedly agree. And of course, not every organisation has got the resource to invest in one-to-ones before the session. So other ways of doing that, very, very good. And is there any tips you've got about using Mentimeter effectively, or any of the other things you've used? Oh, thank you for sharing all that. I love your point about the digital house cleaning, a little bit of like the word so that your word cloud is more accurate as well. And how smart to encourage people to buddy up if they're a bit hesitant about the phone use as well. That's great, because that's been my one hesitation sometimes about using Mentimeter, that people whipping out their phones, does that mean they then get distracted? But it sounds like you've had a really positive response to that as well. Thank you very much. How about others? Just your experience, what's running through your mind at the moment in response to any of this? Yeah, well, what a good question. And I think it is a question we really grapple with, going in, having limited time to build a container where, yeah, there could be all sorts of history and good reasons that people don't feel safe. So I'm happy to share a couple of thoughts, and then Klaus, please come in as well. I think those ground rules can really make a difference. It's not something we just do going through the motions. I often think of it in my own mind, ABC, always be contracting. And I've learnt that from coaching work and group coaching and team coaching. But the ABC is a way that I remind myself to set those ground rules early on, but come back to them as well, whether that's spontaneously in certain moments that are high energy moments, or whether if it's a 2-day meeting, or you come back to them at the beginning of day 2 or after lunch on day 1. How are we doing? So it actually feels like a living agreement. I think that is really important. I think one other thing that's critical, Klaus spoke earlier about who's in the room and having people who are willing to oppose and challenge and disagree and speak out. And I think what happens in a meeting or at an offsite when that first oppose comes into the room is really critical. What you do as the facilitator or what the leader who's holding the meeting, how they respond. Is it defensive? Is it in a spirit of openness? Tell me more. What makes you say that? That is such a critical moment, because I think there are certain things that can bust the container, and there'll be certain things that build the container. And it often comes down to whether something is, to use a slightly technical term, subtractive or additive. And by that, I mean additive, it's really building on and respecting what somebody's saying, versus the subtractive, where it's being cynical or defensive. And the container building hangs in the balance moment by moment, but particularly in the high energy moments. Klaus, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree that, like, that the first moment that there is a real conflict, that's where you set the tone for how do we deal with those moments. And I think something that's very important is, as a facilitator, that you model the container, that your behavior model how to deal with it. And one of the things that I love talking about is what I call charitable interpretations. When somebody says something, it can always be interpreted in multiple different ways and multiple different true ways. So if somebody opposes a proposal, they might do so because there is something that they're onto, there is a weakness in the proposal, and at the same time, it wouldn't be good for them personally, right? So there's like, they are seeing something, right, and there's a selfish interest. Now, what do you do with that? You could point out that they're saying this due to their own selfish reasons, or you can point out that they have a point and let the other one slide. And I think this charitable interpretation, when you consistently listen for the positive contribution in everybody's, not that you want to be blind to the other stuff, you can keep an eye on it, but when people are mirrored in a positive way, they tend to want to live up to that image. And so it's the same with child rearing, really. It's like, what do you mirror back, right? That affects a lot how people will interact in the future. So if you say, well, actually, you have a good point there, and let's include that in the discussion, not to overrule anything, but yeah, it's a good and valid inclusion. People will be like, yes, I made a good, valid, that's nice. Whereas if you say, oh, that's just for your point of view, they might come back with, yeah, but so is the other thing, right? So it's like, do you mirror the highest part of each other's behavior or the more base parts of each other's behavior? I think that's incredibly important for container building. And as a facilitator, you can model what choices you think are good to make in that setting. Personally, so I don't know what Sarah would say, but personally, I think it is very good to get people's input on good ground rules. But I think I would formulate it like, what would be some good ground rules that you think would create a positive conversation? I would be hesitant framing it as, what should happen for you to feel safe? Now, basically, it's the same question, but it's like, does it foreground the productivity or does it foreground the danger, right? What do you foreground in these two? So I would go with what are some good ground rules that would make you feel um, comfortable contributing to a productive conversation. I don't know, Sarah, do you have something there?
The only thought I'm going to share briefly is I've learned from one colleague, and she was often keen to say safe enough, not safe, because we just can't ever be responsible for making another human being feel 100% safe, but just safe enough. And we just frisson in the room is good for dialogue sometimes as well. Or if we've got this sense of like we're on the edge of something, a new understanding here, that might feel a bit scary as well. So safe enough is a term that I sometimes use in dialogue work. Yeah.
That reminds me, this psychologist I mentioned before, Jonathan Haidt, in one of his talks, he shows pictures of playgrounds. And one picture of a playground is basically just a building site, right? With kids like 20 meters up in the air on some ledges or something like that. He's like, too much. And then he has another playground where the floor is cushioned and everything it looks like it's a playground that has melted. So there's no hype. He's like, too little danger. Neither is good. We need a certain amount of something on the line and risk. But it shouldn't be so that, people die, right? It's like, I think it's true. Yeah. Anyway, we're coming towards the end. And as usual, I'll just say that it's been very delightful, and I love that we are now having people who come back for every webinar, and of course, I'll mention that Sarah and I we're doing open workshops. If you're interested in an open workshop, send us a mail, and when we have enough people who have showed interest, then we're gonna look at the calendar and put in some dates. And then we do in-house workshops. And so if you know about somebody who might benefit from having a 2-day course or whatever format it will take on how to optimize dialogue in the organization, maybe in relation to a specific organizational challenge, that is awesome. We like to have our workshops be this wonderful mix between executive teaching and coaching, right? So we teach some tools and we immediately apply it to something that's actually useful for the organization. Then also feel free to just build the bridge and connect us with the people we should be talking to. And otherwise, we have the next webinar next time. What's the topic? I forgot.
I will tell you, it is building a culture of dialogue next Monday.
Building a culture of dialogue next Monday, yes.
Yeah, that will be with Claus. I'm on the pitch with a team next Monday, but you'll hear the full download from Claus and there'll be the chance to discuss things again. And I'm just going to say thank you very, very much for coming today or previous sessions if you're a returner. Sarah, lovely to see you here as well. And I'm sorry I muddled up your name earlier, but welcome, Sarah. Lovely to see you here. And Nicola as well. Very welcome to be here. And I hope you can make next week. And Rini as well. Thank you.